Hello students. Today I am going to discuss about a school of psychology. When psychology first emerged as a science separate from biology and the philosophy, the debate over how to discuss and describe and explain the human mind and behavior began. The different schools of psychology represent the major theories within psychology. So let us discuss about the school of psychology. So students, let us discuss about a school of psychology. So students, when we talk about the school of psychology, so school of psychology always called system of thoughts. Psychology has a long past but only a short history. With these few words, Hermann Ebbinghaus, one of the greatest thinkers in psychology, aptly captured the essence of this field development. Since time immemorial, men and women have pondered over questions that are psychological in nature. From the early Egyptians to the ancient Greek philosopher, there has been no let-up in efforts to understand human thought and the behavior. If we discuss about the full history of the psychology, you would probably be tolling one its for age. Yes, in spite of its long past, the formal history of psychology dates back only 133 years to 1879, the year when William Wundt opened the doors of the first psychological laboratory in Germany. As a result of this scientific movement, Wundt is widely regarded as the founder of psychology. He was also the first person to refer to himself as a psychologist. Yet, this was the just beginning of Wundt's contribution to the field. He went on to become the first of several spirited speakers to engage in an ongoing debate over what should be the focus of psychology. The history of psychology is indeed short, but it has never been short of drama. With that said, let the drama unfold. Now let us discuss about the first school of thought, that is called as structuralism. When we talk about the structuralism, so structuralism is regarded as the earliest school of thought in psychology. While structuralism is usually associated with William Wundt, it was actually his student Edward Titchener, who was largely responsible for presenting structuralism as history remembers it. Let's take a closer look at structuralism. It means how it formed and influence it had on psychology. When we talk about the history of structuralism, so we can say that psychology itself did not emerge as a discipline separate from biology and philosophy until the late 1800s. It was the founded of the very first experimental psychology laboratory in Germany that formally established psychology as a separate science. It was the scientist or William Wundt who was responsible for establishing the lab, which is why he is widely regarded as the father of psychology. Wundt was interested in studying the inner working of the mind in an objective and scientific manner. He utilized a method known as introspection, which involves training observers to carefully analyze the content of their thoughts. While his methods did not stand up to the today's scientific method, they did help make psychology a more scientific discipline. When we talk about the William Wundt, so Wundt's background was in philosophy, which is why many of his experiments involve things such as looking at reaction times and sensory process. Wundt believed that he could carefully analyze each element of the mind, breaking things down into smaller parts, in order to understand how the mind works, in much the same way as a physiologist might look at different parts of the body in order to understand how these parts function together. During this period of history, many areas of science were focused on what is known as elementalism, or breaking things down to their smallest possible parts. This approach had led to a number of important discoveries. It means consider our understanding of things such as cell, molecules, and DNA. So it is not surprising that this same approach entered the emerging field of psychology as well. Now let us discuss about the basics of structuralism. How can structuralism be defined? Basically, structuralism was essentially the study of all the many elements of human consciousness. Much like we might break down all of the parts of a substance into its many different chemical components. One believed that consciousness was also made up of numerous parts. Through his process of introspection, he believed that he could scientifically analyze and identify the various elements of the human mind. Edward B. Titchener. Yes, Edward B. Titchener is the follower of William Wundt. The introspection process involved presenting some type of stimulus to a highly trained observer. The observer would then report on their experience, including thoughts, feelings, sensation, and the perceptions. William Wundt is credited as the founder of structuralism. He did not use the term to refer to his approach. Instead, he called his approach to psychology as voluntarism. It was actually his student Edward B. Titchener who coined the term structuralism. Titchener is credited with introducing Wundt's work in America. Yet, critics note that he largely misinterpreted much of his mentor's work. Despite this, Titchener became a strong force in early psychology and is responsible for establishing the very first school of thought in psychology, that is called structuralism. And yes, thanks to Titchener's influence, structuralism became the important force during the early years of psychology. But it was not without its critics. The school of thoughts known as functionalism soon emerged, partially in response to structuralism rather than simply looking at the parts of consciousness. Functionalism stressed looking at the purpose and function of human thoughts and behavior. The two schools of thoughts became competing elements in psychology. The psychologist Mary Wollstonecraft called for a reconciliation between the two approaches. But Wundt famously derived functionalism as merely literature, while American psychologist and philosopher William James dismissed structuralism as having no thought. While many schools of thoughts continue to have an influence today, structuralism essentially disappeared when Titchener died. While structuralism was relatively short-lived, it played an important role in the development of early psychology and had an influence on the emergence of experimental psychology. So why study structuralism if it has been largely replaced by other schools of thoughts such as psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and cognitive psychology? Structuralism still has an important role to play during the beginnings of psychology, and understanding how it emerged can give students a greater appreciation of how psychology developed into what it is today. So now students, let us discuss about the second school of thought, that is called a functionalism. When we talk about the second school of thought, that is called a functionalism, so William James is the founder of functionalism, often considered the father of American psychology. James was one of the first to advocate a functional approach to the field. William James was a Harvard professor and leading thinker of late 19th century in America. William James was the first American psychologist who focused a different perspective on how psychology should operate. James was introduced to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection and accepted it as an explanation of an organism's characteristics. Key to that theory is the idea that natural selection leads to organisms that are adapted to their environment, including their behavior. Adaptation means that a trait of an organism has a function for the survival and reproduction of the individual, because it has been naturally selected. As James saw in psychologists' purpose was to study the function of behavior in the world, and as such, his perspective was known as functionalism. Harvey Carr, John Dewey, Stanley Hall, and the Cattell. These are the followers of functionalism school of thought. When we talk about the John Dewey, he is an American philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer. Dewey's 1896 paper, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, is considered the first major work of functionalism. When we talk about the Harvey Carr, Carr was an American psychologist and chairman of the University of Chicago's Psychology Department, which has become the hub of the functionalist movement between 1926 to 1938. He is the best known for the crippling experiment, a famous stimulus and response test conducted on rats, which he ran with John Watson. When we talk about the purpose of study in the school of thought, which is called a functionalism, functionalism focused on how mental activities helped an organism fit into its environment. Functionalism has a second, more subtle meaning in that functionalists were more interested in the operation of the whole mind rather than of its individual parts, which were the focus of structuralism. Like Wundt, James believed that introspection could serve as one means by which someone might study mental activities, but James also relied on more objective measures, including the use of various recording devices and examinations of concrete products of mental activities and of anatomy and physiology. Functionalism is a psychological philosophy that describes the mind as a functional tool that allows us to adapt to our environments. It points that our mental states and behaviors are survival mechanisms in line with our inherent biological goals, sound like evaluation. That's because functionalism or functional psychology stems directly from Darwin's school of thought, emerging in the late 19th century as a counter to the prevailing theory of structuralism. Unlike structuralism, which tries to simply understand our subjective experience of consciousness, functionalism also aims to find meaning and purpose in what we experience. The greatest discovery of generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitudes. It's called William James, which was the American psychologist. Now let us discuss about the key terms of functionalism school of thought. An approach to psychology that analyzes mental states and behaviors in terms of their purposes, placing an emphasis on the broad capacities of the human mind. Functionalism marked a major departure from conventional structuralist ideas in psychology from the 19th century onwards. A strand of psychology that considers our mental process, emotions and behaviors as strategies we use in order to adapt to and survive in our environments. The origin of functionalism was traced back to William James, the renowned American psychologist of the late 19th century. James was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evaluation. This is all about the history of functionalism. When James was influenced by Darwin's theory of evaluation, it was critical of the structural approach to psychology that has dominated the field since its inception. James argued that instead of focusing on the specific introspective element that make up our consciousness, psychology should consider the purpose of consciousness, psychological states, and behavior. Although James is credited as being the first to advocate for a functional approach to psychology, the school of functionalism itself did not fully emerge until later in the 19th century, when scholars at the University of Chicago began to formalize the theory. It was here that John Dewey, Harvey Carr, and James Angel would all develop functionalism, focusing especially on the biological and animal dimensions of learning and the behavior. Another group of functionalists would emerge in Columbia University, most notable Edward Thorndike. Thorndike's work on reinforcement theory and behavior analysis provided the basics for the empirical laws that emerged under behaviorism later in the 20th century. As functional psychology developed, so too did the field of experimental psychology. Most functionalists of the early 20th century also pioneered novel technique in lab and field analysis of human and animal behavior. The experimental method in psychology has led to major breakthrough in our understanding of the functional organization of our brain, as psychologists continue to use experiments to manipulate certain variables that may explain our behavior. Functionalism had an important influence on the trajectory of psychology from the 19th century onward. Once functionalism took off, most structuralist ideas which had previously dominated the field were disputed and did not make their way into the modern psychology we know today. Most notable functionalism led directly to the emergence of behaviorism in the mid-20th century, which views human behavior as a type of reflex in response to external stimuli. Famous behaviorists include B.F. Skinner and Ivan Pavlov based many of their ideas around reinforcement learning and conditioning on the finding of functionalists. You have likely heard of Pavlov's famous classical conditioning experience in which he conditioned dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. That probably would not have happened without functionalism, which was the starting point for studies that consider our mental process and behavior as responses to external stimuli. The field of behaviorism and its practical application in applied behavior analysis, which uses empirical approaches to encourage positive behavior, would go on to become a hugely popular philosophy in clinical psychology and continues to be used today as an intervention for people with conditions such as autism, dementia, and addiction. Functionalism also had a direct influence on the education system in the US. This was largely due to John Dewey's theory that children should learn at the pace that best suits their level of intellectual development, and the curriculum should encourage students to draw from their own interests and experiences. Functionalist and behaviorist ideas are also used in special education settings as a tool for positive behavior support. Finally, the experimental tradition that grew up alongside functionalism brought a wide range of research methods that are still used in modern psychology today. These include observation studies, physiological measures, mental states, and questionnaires. But there are so many controversies in functionalism approach. Functionalism is sometimes considered the bridge between early structuralist based ideas and modern behaviorism. Naturally, it has received criticism from both schools of thoughts. At first, structuralists argued that functionalism did not fully define or attempt to understand the mental process they were dealing with, instead of trying to explain mental states and behaviors in the context of external stimuli or the environmental stimuli. Structuralists believe that psychologists should focus on introspection and understanding so these aspects of consciousness for what they are. They also argued against the applied nature of functional psychology, believing that it is distracted from the core goal of identifying the structure of consciousness. Behaviorists in the mid-late 20th century would also take issues with some aspects of functionalism. While functionalists believed it was important to accept the role of consciousness and internal cognition such as pre-existing beliefs, behaviorists were only concerned with the study of human behavior and rejected any idea that did not view mental states as directly influenced by external stimuli. So students, let us discuss about the another school of thought that is called psychoanalysis. As we all are aware that Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis. As we all are aware that psychoanalytic theory proposed that most of the mind is unconscious. Our impulses, our wishes, these are the part of our unconscious mind. As a theory of personality, psychoanalysis was based on the idea that much of our lives is governed by unconscious motives and impulses that originate in childhood conflicts. Psychoanalysis suggests that people can experience catharsis and gain insight into their current state of mind by bringing the content of the unconscious into conscious awareness. Through this process, a person can find reliefs from psychological distress. Psychoanalysis also suggests that a person's behavior is influenced by their unconscious drives. Emotional and psychological problems such as depression and anxiety are often rooted in conflicts between the conscious and unconscious mind. Personality development is heavily influenced by the events of early childhood. Freud suggested that personality was largely set in stone by the age of 5. People use defense mechanisms to protect themselves from information contained in the unconscious part. A skilled analyst can help a person bring certain aspects of their unconscious mind into their conscious awareness by using psychoanalytic strategies such as dream analysis and the free association technique. Sigmund Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis, as I have already discussed about it, and the psychodynamic approach to psychology. Freud believed that the human mind was composed of three elements. The first is it, the second is ego, and the third is superego. Freud's theories of psychosexual stages, the unconscious and dream symbols are still popular among both psychologists and laypeople, but others view his work with skepticism. Many of Freud's behaviorists or the observations and theories were based on clinical cases and case studies. This made his finding difficult to generalize to the larger population. Still, Freud's theories changed how we think about the human mind and behavior and left a lasting mark on psychology and the culture. Erik Erikson is another theorist associated with psychoanalysis. Erikson expanded on Freud's theories and stressed the importance of growth throughout the lifespan. Erikson's psychosocial stages theory of personality remains influential today in our understanding of human development. According to the American Psychological Association, psychoanalysis can people help understand themselves by exploring their unrecognized impulses and are hidden in the unconscious. Today, psychoanalysis encompasses a number of fields. Applied psychoanalysis, which applies psychoanalytic principles to the study of art, literature, and the real-world settings and the situations. Neuropsychoanalysis, which applies neurosciences to psychoanalytic topics such as dreams and the repression. When we talk about the psychoanalytic therapy, so many of the criticism of psychodynamic approaches are based on the earlier Freudian approaches to treatment. More recently, however, research has demonstrated that this approach can have a number of benefits. While traditional Freudian approaches have fallen out of favor, modern approaches to psychoanalytic therapy emphasize a non-judgmental and empathetic approach. In psychotherapy, people are able to feel safe as they explore feelings, desires, memories, and stressors that can lead to psychological difficulties. Research has demonstrated that the self-examination utilized in the psychoanalytic process can contribute to long-term emotional growth. Now let us discuss about the conscious and unconscious mind. When we talk about the unconscious mind, so it includes all of the things that are outside of our conscious awareness, such as early childhood memories, secret desires, and hidden drives. According to Freud, the unconscious contains things that we might consider to be unpleasant or even socially unacceptable. We bury these things in our unconscious because they might bring us pain or the conflict. While these thoughts, memories, and arguments are outside of our awareness, they still influence how we think and behave. In some cases, the things that are outside of our awareness can influence behavior in negative ways and lead to psychological distress. Now let us talk about the conscious mind. When we talk about the conscious mind, on the other hand, includes everything that is inside of our awareness. The contents of the conscious mind are the things we are aware of or can easily bring into awareness. Freud discussed about the three parts of the personality. The first is it, the second is ego, and the third is superego. Freud believed that an individual's personality had three components, it, ego, and the superego. Let's talk about the id. The first of the key element of personality to emerge is known as the id. The id contains all of the unconscious, basics, and primary urges. Let's talk about the ego. The second aspect of personality to emerge is known as the ego. This is the part of the personality that must deal with the demands of reality. It helps control the urges of the id and make us behave in ways that are both realistic and acceptable, rather than engaging in behaviors that are designed to satisfy our desires and needs. The ego forces us to fulfill our needs in ways that are socially acceptable and realistic. In addition to controlling the demands of the id, the ego also helps strike a balance between our basic urges, our ideas, and the reality. Now let us talk about the superego. The superego is the final aspect of personality to emerge, and it contains our ideas and values. The values and beliefs that our parents and society instill in us are the guiding force of the superego, and it strives to make us behave according to these morals. Now let us talk about the ego's defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are strategies that the ego uses to protect itself from anxiety. These defensive tools act as a safeguard to keep unpleasant or distressing aspects of the unconscious from entering our awareness. When something is experienced as overwhelming or even inappropriate, defense mechanisms keep the information from entering our unconscious, which minimize our distress. Mention the word psychology and few persons would fail to recall Sigmund Freud. Like the structuralist and functionalist before him, Freud believed in studying covert behavior, but unlike his predecessors, Freud was not content with examining only conscious thoughts. He divided head first into the unconscious. Freud compared the human psyche to an iceberg. Only a small portion is visible to others, with most of it lying below the surface. Freud also believed that many of the factors that influence our thoughts and actions lie outside of conscious awareness and operate entirely in our unconscious. Psychology therefore needed to study these unconscious drives, motives, and impulses to arrive at a more complete understanding of the individual. Not all modern psychologists subscribe to Freud's psychoanalytic theory, but none can deny the significant impact that his man has had on psychology. He opened up whole new frontiers in psychology and proposed one of the most comprehensive theories of psychology ever written, complete with explanation of how the unconscious mind works and how personality develops in the early years of life. Many later theorists were influenced directly and indirectly by Freud as they either built on, modified, or reacted to his sometimes controversial views. Freud's work led to the development of the first form of psychotherapy. one which has been modified and used by countless therapists throughout the history of psychology. Even all this, to use Freud's analogy, is just the very tip of the iceberg as far as his contributions are concerned. No other psychological school of thought has received as much attention, admiration, and criticism as Freud's psychoanalytic theory. One of the biggest criticisms is that his theory falls short of being scientific, as many of his conceptions are not testable. Freud also failed to recognize how experiences of the childhood contribute to personality development and focused mainly on psychological disorder rather than more positive adaptive behaviors. Dream analysis, clinical investigation, and free association are the key methods of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis also involves a number of different terms and ideas related to the mind, personality, and treatment. A case study is defined as an in-depth study of one person, group, or event. Some of Freud's most famous case studies include Dora, Little Hans, and Anna O. These cases had a powerful influence on the development of his psychoanalytic theory. In a case study, the researcher attempts to intensively examine every aspect of an individual's life. By closely studying a person, a researcher can gain insight into how an individual's history contributes to their current behavior. Although the hope is that the insight gains from a single case study could apply to others, it is difficult to generalize the results because case studies tend to be highly subjective. In some instances, the factors involved in a particular case are so individualized that they may not apply to others. There are so many of strengths and the weaknesses also. Over the course of the early 20th century, the influence of psychoanalysis grew. It was not, however, without its critics. Despite its flaws, psychoanalysis continued to play a key role in the development of psychology. It influenced our approach to treating mental health conditions and continues to exert an influence on psychology today. Let us talk about the strength of psychoanalysis school of thought. Even though most psychodynamic theories did not rely on experimental research, the methods and theories of psychoanalytic thinking contributed to the development of experimental psychology. Many of the theories of personality developed by psychodynamic thinkers, such as Erikson's theory of psychosocial stages and Freud's psychosexual stage theory, continue to influence the field today. Psychoanalysis opened up a new view on mental illness, particularly that talking through problems with the psychoanalytic professionals could help alleviate a person's psychological distress. Let us talk about the weaknesses of psychoanalytic school of thought. Freud's theories overemphasize the unconscious mind, sex, aggression, and childhood experiences. Many of the concepts proposed by psychoanalytic theorists are difficult to measure and quantify. Most of the Freud's ideas were based on case studies and clinical observations rather than empirical or the scientific research. But there are so many supporters and criticism available in psychoanalytic school of thought. Many people are skeptical of psychoanalysis because the evidence supporting its effectiveness has often been viewed as weak. One of the main arguments by those who are critical of psychoanalysis is that it's not as effective as other treatments. However, some of the research on the effectiveness of psychoanalysis has yielded support. One systematic review of previous studies concludes that psychoanalytic therapy was an effective treatment that resulted in the reduction of symptoms and long-term changes that persisted for years after treatment ended. A 2015 review found that psychodynamic therapy could be effective in the treatment of a number of conditions. It means included depression or the eating disorder, somatic disorders, some anxiety disorders. Another critic is that psychoanalysis often requires an investment of time, money, and the effort. Psychoanalysis is also generally a long-term proposition. In the world we live in today, people are usually seeking fast results and approaches that yield an effective in day, week, or the months. Psychoanalytic therapy typically involves a client and therapist exploring issues over a period of years. Now let us discuss about the another school of thought that is called behaviorism and sometimes is called SR psychology. It means stimulus response psychology. John B. Watson was the father of behaviorism school of psychology. Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike, B. F. Skinner and Gordon Allport. These are the followers of behaviorism school of thought. Despite their differences, structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis all shared an emphasis on mental process, events that are unseen to the naked eye. John B. Watson, a strong supporter of behaviorism, strongly objected to this approach and prompted a revolution in psychology. Watson was an advocate of scientific scrutiny, but for him, covert behavior, including mental process, could not be studied scientifically. The emphasis from his perspective should only be on overt or the observable behavior. Behavioristics believe that human behavior can be understood by examining the relationship between stimuli. It means events in the environment and the responses. It means observable behavior. They saw no need to employ subjective techniques such as introspection to infer mental process over which even trained subjects and researchers could not agree. What was once the study of the mind thus became the study of observable behavior. B. F. Skinner, another famous behaviorist, supported Watson's view by advancing the idea that human behavior can be explained by reinforcement and punishment. Observable environmental factors, which no need to consider inner mental process. Later behaviorists adopted a more balanced view of matters, embracing the study of both overt and the covert behavior. These became known as cognitive behavioristics. Watson's call for greater objectivity, radical as it was, greatly propelled psychology along the path to becoming a science rather than a mere body of philosophical thoughts. Many of the learning theorists used by psychologists today were also born out of the behavioristic school of thought and are frequently applied in behavior modification and treatment of some psychological disorders. It calls phobia, etc. Nevertheless, the strict behaviorist view of Watson was in no way superior to the narrow emphasis of structuralists and functionalists on mental life alone. Indeed, many aspects of human experiences, thinking, motivation, creativity, lies outside a strict behavioral definition of psychology. These too must be studied in order to gain a more complete understanding of the individual. This was one of the key arguments of another emerging school of thought known as Gestalt psychology. Now let us discuss about the another important school of thoughts that is called Kestart school of thought in psychology. The word Gestalt means form, pattern or whole. Gestalt psychologists believe that psychology should study human experience as a whole, not in terms of separate elements as the structuralists would contend. Their slogan, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts," conveyed the idea that meaning is often lost when psychological events are broken down. Only when these pieces are analyzed together and the whole pattern is visible do we find true meaning in our experiences. To use an example, imagine breaking apart the words you are now reading into individual letters and scattering them as you wish across the page. Would you be able to discern anything meaningful from them? Quite likely you would not. Only when the letters are probably combined to form words and then structured into sentence do you grasp into true meaning. The whole then becomes something different, something greater than the accumulation of its parts. Gestalt psychologists such as Max Wertheimer did extensive work on various aspects of cognition, including perception, problem solving, and thinking. Additionally, their insistence on studying individual experience as whole is still preserved in psychology today. Their work also led to the emergence of a form of psychotherapy widely practiced by modern psychologists. Now let us discuss about the third force of psychology. It's called Humanistic School of Thought, which play a very important role in the development of psychology. With the rise of each school of thought mentioned previously, the face of psychology was gradually taking shape. Yet, not all were satisfied with the way things were progressing. Foremost among these were the humanistic psychologists such as Carl Rogers, who were uncomfortable with the highly deterministic view of two of the major forces in psychology: psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Determinism is the idea that our actions are controlled by forces beyond our control. For the psychoanalyst, these forces are unconscious. For the behavioristic, they exist in our environment. Humanistic psychologists, however, viewed humans as free agents capable of controlling their own lives, as opposed to being controlled, making their own choices, setting goals, and working to achieve them. Humanism asserted a positive view of human nature, stressing that humans are inherently good. A unique form of therapy also emerged out of this school of thought, which emphasizes on helping people to achieve their full potential. This differed greatly from psychoanalysis, which only focused on reducing maladaptive behavior. Humanistic psychologists believe that behavioristics are over-concerned with the scientific study and analysis of the action of people as organisms, to the neglect of basic aspects of people as feeling, thinking individuals, and that too much effort is spent in laboratory research, a practice and quantifies and reduces human behavior to its elements. Humanistics also take issues with the determinist orientation of psychoanalysis, which postulates that one's early experiences and drive-in determine one's behavior. The humanist is concerned with the fullest growth of the individual in the areas of love, fulfillment, self-worth, and autonomy. The American psychologist Ibrahim Maslow, considered one of the leading architects of human psychology, proposed a hierarchy of needs or drives in order of decreasing priorities or potency but increasing sophistication. Philosophical needs, safety, belongingness, and love, esteem, and self-actualization. Only when the more primitive needs are met can be individual progress to higher level in the hierarchy. People reaching self-actualization will have fully realized their potential. The concept of the self is the central focal point for most humanistic psychologists. In the personal construct theory of American psychologist George Kelly and the self-centered theory of American psychotherapist Carl Rogers, individuals are said to perceive the world according to their own experiences. This perception affects their personality and leads them to direct their behavior to safety the needs of the total self. Rogers stressed that in the development of an individual's personality, the person strives for self-actualization, to become oneself, self-maintenance, to keep on being oneself, and self-enhancement. In the last few years, since psychology emerged as a distinct science, it has grown and changed in innumerable ways. Each major school of thoughts fought for dominance, but at the end, none emerged as clear winner. At the same time, none were loser. How so? Well, each school of thoughts left an indelible marks on psychology, helping to mold it into the respective discipline that it now is. In addition, many psychologists today adopt an holistic approach. Instead of clinging to one particular perspective, they carefully choose from each school of thought those ideas and methods they believe are most appropriate for achieving their objectives. Psychology has never been, nor will it ever be, a static field of study. Even now, there are new theories being written, new topics being studied, and new ideas yet to be explored. So students, this is all about School of Thoughts, and I hope you understand that how much important each and every school in the development of psychology. Thank you.